Welcome everybody to today's Question Time 101 webinar. My name's Ben Logan-Milne. I'm the education lead in the Parliamentary Engagement team. But much more importantly, we have two expert panelists here to help guide us through the mystery that is Question Time. And those panelists are the Right Honourable Trevor Mallard, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. And David Wilson, the Clerk of the House of Representatives. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure your expertise will be really, really valuable. Just a couple of housekeeping notes about today's webinar. At any point you like, you can post a question into the chat function, and we'll be answering questions throughout the webinar, but also we'll circle back to any general questions or things that we might have missed at the end as well. So let's kick off, and I think as good a place as any to start is with the question, what is Question Time? What happens, who's involved, how long does it last? Mr. Speaker, could you start us off with a sort of Reader's Digest summary of what Question Time is?
Sure. It happens Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays of the weeks of Parliament sitting. It happens generally between 2 and roughly 3 o'clock. We work through 12 questions, and it's a pretty old tradition. It's the bit of Parliament that when you see normal broadcast TV, it's the bit that's most likely to be on the air because it's where the government is held to account. So it doesn't happen in the weeks that Parliament's not sitting. Very, very occasionally when there's urgency, Question Time doesn't happen, but I think both governments and oppositions think it's an important thing to have, and even if there's urgent other business, we generally have it.
So what's the purpose of Question Time? Why does it exist?
Its origins come from holding the government to account. In the Westminster system, traditionally the Parliament was, or the government was quite a lot smaller than our current government by way of proportion, and the government gets on with stuff, and it's the Parliament's job to make sure it's doing the right thing. And in New Zealand, the shape of the way Parliament sits has changed a lot. It used to only sit for 2 or 3 months in the winter, and most members of Parliament only came for what was then called the session. But ministers stayed there and did their work in Wellington, right throughout the year. But it was a way you checked. It's a way that the MPs are doing their job properly.
David, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I think that's a good summary of it. It's really key for Parliament in doing its job and checking that the government is in fact doing its job.
So what's the difference between Question Time and a debate in Parliament?
Well, in Question Time, it's something which is pretty rapid fire. Question, answer. You have primary questions. You have 12 primary questions every day, which are down with notice. People get a couple of hours notice of them, and then some supplementaries averaging out at about 5 for each of those questions. So it's very much back and forth, short questions, relatively short answers. A debate, speeches can be often 10 minutes long, and in exceptional debates, 20 minutes long. And so people talk for a big, long period of time, and then another side responds. So the question times are more intense, and they require a response. So it's got to be responded to.
We've had a question that's come in here in the chat. If I was going to attend Question Time at Parliament, how likely is it that I would be able to see the Prime Minister or the opposition leader speak? And how likely is it that all members of Parliament would be there?
Well, I can answer that, Ben. So on the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition are pretty much always in the House on a Tuesday and a Wednesday for question time. And on Thursdays, they're often in other parts of the country, so they're carrying out other parts of their role.
I'm dropping out. I'm going to shift my position.
And so if you come on a Tuesday or Wednesday, you're very likely to see them both there. And on those days, the Leader of the Opposition invariably asks the first question that's available to the National Party at the moment, and always asks that question of the Prime Minister. So you're very likely to see it if you come those days. On Thursdays, it's really unusual for either of them to be there, and so the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the Opposition will probably have that first exchange of questions.
So I guess the recommendation there would be, if you're coming to see Question Time live and you really want to see the Opposition Leader and the Prime Minister, it should be on a Tuesday or a Wednesday of a sitting day.
That's it.
So this takes us quite neatly to our next slide here. How do we get these questions for Question Time? All the questions prepared beforehand, or some of them are surprise? Maybe David, you could take us through that.
Yeah, so the 12 questions that are asked to ministers at each Question Time are prepared ahead of time. And I think a little bit later in the webinar, we'll talk about the process for that. But yeah, they are, the questions are all written by the people who are going to ask them, or by their parties. And those, once they are accepted, have to be asked exactly as they're written down. But that's only a small portion of the questions. The Speaker mentioned supplementary questions as well, about 5 of those for each primary question, and those are a surprise. Only the person asking them will know what they are. And even then, sometimes they have to hear the answer before they know what they next want to ask. So those supplementary questions are a surprise. They do have to be on the same topic though. It's not a random question and answer session. If you ask a primary question about something, your supplementary questions have to follow from that answer and be on the same topic.
We just put a link in the chat to one of our web pages about how oral questions in Parliament work. Are there any rules about the questions? And we've kind of covered this already, but do people really have to answer the question that they're asked? Mr. Speaker, do we still have a decent connection with you? Could you take this one?
Now, can you, I'm not sure if you can see me or not. I've shifted locations closer to a router, so is that working?
Well, we can certainly hear you, so that's good.
Right. Well, that's probably a massive advantage from your perspective. It's showing my video is going, but I'm not sure that I can do anything more about it. The short answer is that there's an obligation to at least attempt to address the questions if it's in the public interest. So if there's a decision that has to be made around that, but then there's a question which goes to the quality of the answer, and in the end, there's not a lot of responsibility to give a high quality answer. There's a political responsibility. There are problems for members who don't answer questions well, but most of the time they don't. There's not a. You can't, for example, be forced to answer yes or no to a question. But if ministers regularly don't answer questions, then they get a very bad reputation, and there are political consequences from it. Now, the one big exception is that there might be some national security or court case or pending police matter or something like that, and a minister can get up and say, I decline to answer that question because it's not in the public interest.
So who decides if a question has or hasn't been answered satisfactorily in question time?
Well, in the end, it's my decision as to whether it's been properly addressed, and on occasions I indicate my displeasure at the quality of the answer by allowing further opposition supplementary questions in order to effectively punish the minister and to encourage them to be forthright and straightforward with the Parliament.
So there's an incentive then, I suppose, to answer the question when asked.
There is, because one, you're going to get more pressure, and two, when that happens, the minister who does it ends up looking pretty stupid, and that doesn't help.
We just posted another link in the chat to a fact sheet on the order paper, the list of things Parliament's doing, and oral questions. So let's look at a little infographic about how questions actually get arrived at or get lodged. This first section is about how they're allocated each sitting day. David, could you take us through this first part?
Yeah, sure. So there are 12 questions to ministers, as been mentioned. There are questions that can be asked to people who are not ministers as well, chairs of select committees, for example, about something they're responsible for, but that's pretty rare. So the questions are allocated proportionally to each party based on the number of seats it's got in the House, but excluding ministers. So that's why the opposition always has a large share of the questions, which is right, because they're primarily the ones who are going to want to hold the government to account. When the questions, so every day they're allocated, they're in a different order each day, so different parties have a turn at asking the first and second questions. The bigger parties obviously get more turns to do that. The questions are brought to my office each day between 10 and 10:30. I would go through them with the parties who are lodging them to make sure they're in order, that they line up with our standing orders, our rules for how Parliament works. And there are some rules about questions. They've got to be asked, for example, to a minister for something they're responsible for. So they can't be asked about a court case, for example. They can't be asked for something that has been done in another country if there's no responsibility for it in New Zealand. And so I check those things. And often there are statements and questions. The person lodging it also has to authenticate it, so they have to provide some written proof that what they're asking about in the question is actually correct. So we check those things with them. Once I'm happy with the questions, we publish them and then send them to the ministers who are going to have to answer them. And then at 11:30 every day, I take them over to the Speaker to approve them.
So, Mr. Speaker, are there occasions when you don't approve questions that have come across your desk for that day's question time?
Yes, generally about once a week or once a fortnight, I end up asking for a question to be changed. It's not generally a question of ruling them out completely, but often I think there's extraneous matter. There's a lot more in the question that needs to be in it to actually make sense of the question. So it might be edited down. Occasionally, I'm not satisfied with the authentication for a question, and something has to be adjusted. Sometimes there's got to be a bit more of a focus on ministerial responsibility than there is. But generally, by the time they get to me, they've gone through with the clerk a pretty thorough audit process.
Someone asks, is there crossover between topics of questions asked in question time and the general debate?
Well, often there is a bit of a crossover, because the questions that people are asking are likely to be about the topics of the day, or many of them will be. And again, on a Wednesday during the general debate, there's likely to be a lot of focus on what's happening on the day in the world or in the country, or what the issue is. So there's often a crossover, but there doesn't have to be. You can have general debates on quite different topics to what's been questioned just beforehand.
Someone else asks a really interesting question. Do members of Parliament need to stand to ask their question? For example, if a member of Parliament used a wheelchair?
The answer to that is, I don't think we've been in a position in the New Zealand Parliament yet where people haven't. When I had a pretty severe injury, was using a wheelchair to get around, but managed to haul myself up in order to ask the question. But we have thought carefully about if someone came into the House who was wheelchair bound, what we would do. And there's no doubt we would do some shifting around of the furniture to make room for them. And we would get some sort of hand signalling process to go in order to give them the call. It will happen one day, and I think we'll be ready for it.
So if we move on from our infographic here to our next slide about the rules for MPs in question time, this is something that came up in some questions we had earlier. Are there certain types of language that aren't allowed during question time? And I think we should probably not use examples.
Right. Well, I think the general line is that the language has got to be parliamentary. It's you've got to avoid what might generally be described as rude or obscene, and members don't have much trouble with that. Very, very occasionally, we will have a debate because someone will be trying to use a quote as part of a question, and that quote itself might be marginal. There's probably a tiny bit more latitude for that, but that's it. But questions have to be asked in English and Maori or in New Zealand Sign Language.
This is a good question for you both. Have some rules changed over the years? David, maybe you could tell us about some ways the question time rules might have shifted.
Yeah, I mean, they've actually been pretty constant in their current form since about 1996. Prior to and there was an earlier set of reforms in 1985. Prior to those, we didn't have the system of 12 questions each day. It was more like it is in a lot of other parliaments in the Commonwealth, where as many questions as possible were asked in a certain amount of time, and the others might become written questions afterwards. So that's been solidified into a predictable 12 questions. Each question doesn't have a time limit. It's just that it generally takes about an hour each day, and the questions and answers have to be no longer than necessary to address their topic. I think one of the key areas of change has been in how the rules around questions have been interpreted by speakers, and probably since Lockwood Smith was Speaker, and Speaker subsequent to him, David Carter, and the current Speaker, Trevor Mallard, have been more insistent on members providing an informative answer to a question rather than skirting around that by just addressing it. I mean, addressing a question can mean just talking about the same topic, but I think there's actually been a stricter approach to that, which has been much better because it's meant that ministers have had to provide more informative answers. So the rules as written haven't changed about that, but the rulings that speakers give, which we treat as precedents and become sort of auxiliary rules, have become a bit more focused on getting good answers over time, which can only be a good thing.
I think the other major thing that's changed in my time is around how we treat supplementary questions. What we used to do was we used to compete for those supplementary questions, and you'd have members from right around the Parliament standing up asking for supplementary questions, and the Speaker would choose. Now it's become much more structured. Parties have organised their people to do them, and members are much more likely to read their supplementary questions, and often, or generally, if they're government ones, they've been ones which have been supplied by ministers. So there's a lot less spontaneity in question time now compared to what there was in the past. It was really only in the late 1980s that ministers started preparing what we call PATSI supplementaries that are designed to make the minister look good.
We posted a couple of links in the chat to the Speaker's rulings, which David, you mentioned earlier, and the standing orders. And that takes us quite nicely to the next question. Who actually makes these rules for what has to happen during question time?
Well, every 3 years, the Parliament reviews its rules. There's a committee with representation from each of the parties. They make some decisions. We're currently going through the process now. They report and the rules are adjusted starting after the general election. So people don't know if the rules are going to be if they're going to be in government or opposition, and therefore don't know who's going to be advantaged by them. So that's the standing orders. The interpretation of those, especially if it's an interesting interpretation or at all precedent setting or something that's important for the long term, goes into a book called Speaker's Rulings, and what that does is give a bit of an interpretation of the standing orders.
We have a question here from the Facebook live stream of today's webinar. If a minister is kicked out of the debating chamber, but they were going to be asked a question, what happens to the question?
Another minister has to answer it. So
would that work the same for a member of parliament who was going to ask a question, but was then ejected?
On that particular case, it would depend on the terms of their ejection, but generally the story would be that they would give another member permission to ask the question, normally one of their own team. If they don't, then the question just drops off.
Another question in the chat here. Are questions released to the public before they're debated in the House?
Yes, they're published on the parliamentary website at 11:30 each day, and they're put out as a media release as well.
So on our next slide here, do other parliaments have question time like us? Are we unique, or is this something that's practiced in other countries?
Well, I think all of the parliaments that have come out of the Westminster system, so the old Commonwealth countries, all have a system pretty similar to ours, where the executive is part of the legislature, and questions are asked that way. That's it differs in some countries, like the United States, where the executive is separate and don't go in. I mean, they go into committees, but they don't go into the House to answer questions in the same way.
David, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, it is pretty much universal. And I think if you go to another Westminster Parliament, you'll see something that you'd recognise as question time, even though the details of it are a bit different.
Another question here. Has question time changed in any other way during the course of our Parliament's history? I guess apart from the rules about who can ask and who has to answer, have there been any major developments since the start of our Parliament in questioning the government?
Well, I of course wasn't around at the beginning of our Parliament, but the system has been, generally quite similar. It's been, there've been sort of minor adjustments to the way that it works, but generally it's probably become more structured, more party based since MMP. Fewer independent questions coming in. A lot fewer electorate type questions. What is the effect of this particular policy going to be on Wainuiomata? That sort of question is very, very rare these days, whereas it used to be sort of core business.
The only other major change I mentioned is that question time and more parliamentary proceedings have been broadcast. So 1935 for radio, and in the around 2000 for television. There were concerns that would really change the behaviour of members in the chamber. It doesn't appear to have, but I'm sure that questions are asked and answered with that wider viewing and listening audience in mind. Of course, it's also webcast now and live streamed as well.
And you can tune into the question time broadcast on Parliament's excellent website and the Parliament on Demand section, as well as through TV broadcasting channels. Thought I'd throw in a little plug there for the excellent Parliament website. So any last thoughts you have about question time? Any particular insights or pieces of wisdom you'd like to add in here?
Well, I'd just like to say that I've seen a lot of people sort of asking and answering questions over my time. I think in my time, if you count Bill English's too, there's been 10 leaders of the National Party and 9 leaders of the Labour Party. They all have their different styles, but I think those that do the best at question time, both asking the questions and answering the questions, are those who do the preparation beforehand. And I think that probably the classic for that was Helen Clerk. I mean, she wasn't a great orator, she wasn't a great wit from either side, but her preparation was always evident, and she knew that if she was asking a question, there could be 3 or 4 ways that the minister she was asking could go. So she'd be prepared for that. But then she'd have supplementaries for each of those, and each of those supplementary questions could have, 2 or 3 or 4 different answers. And she worked through a lot of the options beforehand, and it meant that she was prepared with supplementaries. Too often, members these days just go through a set list of supplementary questions which don't relate to what they've been told. And it sometimes means that they look a bit foolish as they do it.
David, any last thoughts from you on question time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's often contrasted to the rest of the time in Parliament as being much more adversarial. And I think that's true, it is, but it is the time when ministers are put to the test and they're asked to defend their decisions and policies, which have enormous effects for the country, involve the spending of a lot of taxpayers' money. I think it's pretty reasonable that it is a time when ministers are really tested. But I think it is worth people also having a look at some of the other things that happen in Parliament and in select committees, where you'll see things are quite a lot more convivial and cooperative, because the main focus of those other things, lawmaking, for example, isn't to put the government under a microscope. So it certainly probably appears a bit more adversarial and fierce than members are towards each other most of the time.
We just put a link in the chat to written questions, which you brought up earlier, both of you. So have a look at that if you're interested in the difference between oral and written questions. We'll go now to a sort of general Q&A. So now's your chance to ask any questions you were holding back on. And we have one here. Can questions be donated from one party or one member to another?
The answer to that is yes. Yes, they can be. There's a roster of questions that's worked out at the beginning of a parliament, but parties can give questions to any other party.
And as well as donating them, the supplementary questions are given at the Speaker's discretion. Although they're rostered, it is still up to him whether parties get to ask them and how many. The current system in operation is that they can be deducted for poor behaviour in the House, and other parties, as the Speaker said, can be given more if they're not getting adequate answers to their questions. So there is some flexibility there.
Someone asks, how often are all the members sitting for question time?
Well, it would be very, very rare to have all 120 members in the Parliament. It's often, well, and until the recent effects, often there would be a member or two overseas. You have people with urgent engagements and you have people sick. But if there's any time during the week when just about every member is going to be there, it'll be between 2 and 3 on a Tuesday and Wednesday. Numbers tend to drop off a little bit on a Thursday. You often have, 20% of the people who are not there.
Another question is, given, this is probably one for you, Mr. Speaker, given the Speaker is from the government, how do they remain impartial in their rulings?
Yeah, well, the first point I make is that the Speaker is not from the government. The Speaker is not part of the government. The government is the ministers or the Executive Council, the under-secretaries. But for the vast majority of my time, with only one exception, when Peter Tapsell was a member of the Labour Party and a Speaker when the National Party formed the government, the Speaker has been someone from the governing party. You sort of I liken it to reffing a game of sport for kids when one of your own kids is involved, and that is that I tend to try and be a little bit harder on the team. You know, you're a little bit harder on your own kids, a little bit harder on your home team, just to show that you're not biased towards them.
Someone asks from the Facebook live stream again, is there an archive of question time recordings before 2008, before Parliament TV channel came along?
There's a written archive of them all, going right back to the first ones, which is Hansard, and that is available online and also in hard copy. As far as I know, there isn't a sound archive of them all.
Another question from the Facebook live stream. Has the Prime Minister, or it should be, I guess, has a Prime Minister ever been kicked out of the debating chamber?
They certainly have been. There was one day when Jerry Wall was the Speaker, Sir Jerry Wall was the Speaker, and both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition were tossed out of the chamber at the same time.
David brought up the Hansard, the written record of debates. We've just put a link in the chat to the Hansard, and where you can find more information about it. Someone asks, how can the public have input into question time?
Well, if people think that there are issues that are important and that they'd like questions asked on, then the best thing is to make contact with one of the MPs who lives relatively close to you and to discuss the issue with them. And if they think it's important enough, they'll take it to their team, to their what they call their procedures meeting in the morning, and have a discussion as to whether that will make a priority or not.
Another question from the Facebook live stream. Have there been any funny moments that you've had as the speaker, or I guess as the clerk, during question time? Anything stands out?
Well, I think for me, probably earlier in my career, watching the wit of David Longy, who could be just exceptionally funny in the chamber and very, very quick. That for me would be like a standout highlight. You know, Geoffrey Palmer on occasions would be funny, but from quite a different point of view. Geoffrey couldn't say it rained a lot on the west coast. He'd say there was excessive pluviality on the western side of the ranges. You know, he'd use 15 words which were long when one short word would do, and sometimes had us rolling with laughter. He didn't quite work out why we were laughing at him.
I'll just add, I mean, you know, some MPs are really funny, and many of them are good public speakers as well. One of the things for me sitting in the chamber as an impartial advisor to all parties is not to be seen to be on anyone's side. And so I guess one of the skills for being a clerk in the debating chamber is to keep a poker face at all times. So you might laugh inside your head, but you certainly don't show it.
If anyone has any last questions, now's a really good time to paste them into the chat. We'll give you a few moments to pop something in there. It's probably a good time to remind people that if you have questions that you think of later, you can definitely get in contact with us and we'll get back to you with an answer. We've just posted a link in the chat to more in-depth information about question time. And we have one last question here, which is from Facebook. The sound system when watching on TV, it's more of a comment, this is terrible. Mainly seems to be when it's an important debate. Who's in charge of this system?
Me.
It's David's fault. I'll make the first comment. The last week or so that the House was sitting, we had some fault in there which people spent quite a lot of time trying to identify during the breaks, but couldn't. I haven't had a report back yet about whether it's been sorted out, but it is uneven. It can sometimes work really well in the chamber and not well outside. And then there are other occasions when it's working perfectly to Parliament TV and not working as well in the chamber. It's a funny beast.
And the sound feed's going to 3 different places. Just for people who are interested, it's going out onto the TV feed, of course. It's being used through the microphones inside the chamber so that members can hear each other. It's quite a big room. And it's also sound feed is going to the Hansard reporters as well, so they can produce that record of it. So that doesn't affect the sound quality, but it's for a variety of purposes.
We'll do one last question because it's a really interesting one. Mr. Speaker, have you had any embarrassing moments in the chamber that you'd like to share?
Well, I've had a few embarrassing moments in the chamber, some of which I'm not quite prepared to share yet. There's one or two that I'm saving up for my valedictory or my last speech. But you know, some of the most embarrassing things is when I mix members up within the chamber. It took me quite a lot of time with the. There was a group of new National Party males who were all seemed to be about the same age, come from a variety of places around the country, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember which was which for quite a long time. And that it is very embarrassing when you call someone by the wrong name. But unlike Simon Bridges, I've never done Paula Benefit.
Well, look, thank you both for being part of today's webinar. It's been really, really great, and thank you for answering all those questions. If any of you watching this live stream or on Zoom have another webinar topic that you'd like to suggest, or you have more questions about what we've covered today, you can contact us on education.team@parliament.govt.nz. It's the same email address you registered for the webinar on if you're watching via Zoom. Thank you very much for everyone for attending, and thank you again, Mr. Speaker and David, for helping us out with this webinar today.
It's a pleasure. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for popping in.